Good morning, friends. I guess I'm about a minute or less earlier than scheduled, but let's begin. I will, of course, start with thanking Shabnam Hashmi for inviting me to speak at this seminar. And also, even before I start, thank Faizan Alam for actually working with me from last evening to see that I got Facebook Live right, because I've never been on this platform before. So thank you, and thank you to every one of you out there who is listening, who I can't see. I see this as a really important conversation. Um, uh, I'm only one of the many who will speak on this subject, but I'm also seeing it not so much as a talk, as one part of a conversation that we can continue to have on a subject really on which increasingly our collective survival as a people depends. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this. It is, in fact, a question of life, death, and freedom. Um, to begin, uh, as a as a kind of a prelude, uh, I've been exceedingly worried since the morning about the gas leak in Vizag, and I'm speaking against that backdrop. So that kind of is literally hanging fire. But I will try and focus on what we are supposed to do at this session, while putting that on the table as as a concern, and as something that we all need to be deeply worried about, in addition to everything else that is confronting us today. I would also like to register my deep concern and protest against the several arrests against the unlawful activities, several arrests under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act that have taken place over the past couple of years, but also more recently, the Jamia students, and the several detentions and arrests that have happened in Kashmir since August. And I think none of this is actually divorced from or separate from the subject of today's discussion, which is on the communalization of India. I also think that when we speak about the communalization of India, we have fast moved away from the term communalization, which itself seems so inadequate to describe what we have, the reality that we have confronting us today. There are extreme forms of bigotry and hate that fuel extreme forms of exclusion and violence, both by private actors and by the state, with a largely silent judiciary. And that is really something that is even more worrying, uh, where the where the what we might take as a normal expression of judicial empathy, as for instance, was the case with Justice Muralidhar's decisions on the violence in Northeast Delhi. What we might actually take for granted as a normal expression of judicial empathy becomes really an extraordinary expression, and something that is completely out of the ordinary and out of the normal course of what has come to be called justice. So, really, what we are facing is state practice that normalizes vindictiveness, that normalizes targeted violence, and that normalizes carceral regimes uh, where incarceration is the norm and freedom the exception. And so everybody is either arrested or anticipating arrest. And the only guarantee of free speech is free speech that falls within the definition of incitement to violence, and free speech that falls within the definition of hate speech. So, really, is this something, is the term communalization even adequate anymore to describe the realities that we are battling, to describe the surveillance regimes that we are all subject to, uh, and to describe the the rule by fear and the rule by maiming, which is such an expressive term that Jasbir Kaur uses, the politics of maiming. Is this something that we can describe adequately through the use of the term communalization? It is majoritarianism. It is, a violent supremacist regime. It is, authoritarianism fueled by Hindutva politics. And it brings in its wake violence against Muslims centrally. It brings also in its wake violence against Dalits. We can't forget that, caste supremacy and Hindu supremacy are fused together. But it also brings violence and extreme forms of dispossession and discrimination against Adivasis. We saw the judicial expression of the dispossession of Adivasis, for instance, in the recent Chebrolu case, where the Supreme Court ruled that special protections for Adivasi teachers in public schools in Adivasi homelands are in fact 100% reservations, impermissible under the 50% rule set down by Indra Sahni. It's not reservations, it is special protections. And it comes within the larger framework of Schedule 5 protections. So we are in fact seeing a spiraling dispossession that ties one vulnerable community to another within either a carceral regime or within a regime of dispossession. So it's not, you can't escape it completely. If that is the form that it takes, and both forms are violent, and they are expressions of structural violence, if that is the form that it takes for communities that have a special claim to protection against discrimination under Article 15, what are the other ways in which this system, in fact, silences or surveils any kind of a move to express dissent or express a claim to what I have called the Constitution as commons, because this what is being ruled now and the rule by maiming is certainly not an expression of the Constitution as we know it. It passes as constitutional law or constitutional jurisprudence. It passes as the writ of the executive, but it is certainly not the Constitution that belongs to us all collectively, and that we understand and that we lay a claim to quite legitimately as citizens of this free country. There are, of course, several other parts to this, and I will try and plot those different parts, particularly the parts that I find myself constantly entangled in all the time. One major part of it has to do with the capture of higher education. And we need make no mistake of it. We saw what happened in Jamia and in Aligarh and in JNU. We saw what happened in Hyderabad University 3-4 years ago. And it is the fate of higher education generally. So we do have some, aggravated instances that are really warning signs that are sent out to institutions at large. But generally, if we are in higher education, and whether in a research institute or in a university, the environment is really quite worrying. And for teachers and research scholars who are, pursuing their vocation, who are, doing their research, who are not necessarily concerned. Everybody is not necessarily talking only about dissent or about right-wing politics or about majoritarianism. There are people who are talking about several different areas of research. But irrespective of what area of research you pursue, there are times when the majoritarian agenda actually hits at you directly. So it is not really your competence in research. You could be working on displacement, you could be working on geographical indications, you could be working on political representation, you could be working on any of a series, intellectual property, you could be working on just any topic. But then you are told that if you actually put together a project on Hindu religion and culture, or if you put together a project on, traditional forms of representation, or on mythology, or now the latest, of course, is on the curative properties of Ganga Jal in the light of COVID. Tomorrow we will have suggestions of the curative properties of Ganga Jal for the gas tragedy that we are facing in Vizag. And the refusal to enter that then gets construed as as anti-national, or the opposite of patriotism, whatever that might be, or even simply insubordination. So, what institutions of higher education are actually battling is, one, the fact that any critique of majoritarian politics, any critique of Hindutva regimes, any critique of draconian legislation, and the truncated, uh, you know, uh, the truncated space for constitutionalism comes within the meaning of anti-national activity. But also the refusal to move from what your area of expertise is to these new and extremely vacuous areas of research is also construed as insubordination. And research funding really is channeled along paths of compliance rather than along paths of robust competence or diligence demonstrated through existing research. And this is a dilemma that institutions of research and higher education face, particularly in terms of what kinds of research and what kinds of pedagogical praxis you will put in place with younger scholars and faculty members who are at the entry level or at mid level in their careers, and have far-reaching implications for the futures of research in this country. We also have, unfortunately, a scientific community that is compliant to Hindutva regimes, with the exceptions are few. So we don't have a strong enough voice, for instance, from the scientific community against, the Ganga Jal claim, or against, for instance, the claim that plastic surgery and aerodynamics were known in ancient India, where I mean it with the kind of with the kind of education and scientific and technical education that has been possible in India, it still surprises me why the entire scientific community didn't just hit the roads when claims like this were made. Why was there this silence? I also have very shocking kind of anecdotes, because I'm constantly, I guess, as a sociologist, as somebody who is constantly observing behavior at a routine everyday level, I'm constantly interested in how people react to particular situations. And for me, the entire fracas around the congregation of the Tablighi Jamaat was extremely instructive. It was instructive in two ways, primarily. The first was the total conflation of the Tablighi Jamaat with Muslim. The second was the drawing of the lines of we and they. And I was shocked, to find that right from very ordinary, class 4, class 3 employees in government institutions, saying, it's not us, they, are doing this, and they are, responsible for spreading corona, and they need to understand. And I then stopped a young colleague of mine and said, who is us and who is they? Since when have we started forging solidarities on the basis of religion? And clearly, what you mention as us is not us. If I don't think like you, then you and I don't form us. And I'm not willing to simply put, an effigy there and put everybody into that effigy and name that effigy they, to be taken to the stake. I said there, there has to be a different way in which we construct the we and the they. And increasingly, I feel really that we have to go back, really. We have to go back to the basics. And the basics happens right from the point that we begin to forge solidarities. What is the definition today as citizens of India, as citizens who believe in the Constitution, as citizens who are part of the we that recite the preamble as an anthem of resistance? Who then are the we? Can we begin to plot and map the we first before we before we begin to even think about the future of this politics? And interestingly for me, while I was able to convince this younger friend who lives in fairly sequestered, segregated environments with very little exposure. So I was able to convince this friend better than, for instance, a very highly placed scientist who retired as a professor of molecular biology or one of the biological sciences, who just turned around and said, the problem with this spread of coronavirus is all these fellows, and then proceeded to name the Tablighi Jamaat. And no amount, and this is a person who understands science, who understands viruses better than I do, and no amount of convincing can ever bring him around to talking about talking about the pandemic and viruses without conflating the coronavirus with the contagious viralities of communalized hate politics. Both of them have become completely fused with each other in his understanding. And it is this, it is this refusal, because it isn't a lack of awareness. It is a refusal to see and a refusal to reckon with the extremely destructive, disastrous politics that right-wing nationalism entails. And that refusal, in fact, is nothing short of complicity. It is complicity. It fuels the incitement to violence. Because when a Kapil Mishra, in fact, incites a crowd to violence, it is these habitations of complicity that give him the courage to do it and that bestow the impunity on him. So the impunity to people like Kapil Mishra is not coming only from the state. It is not coming only from the judiciary. It is coming importantly from a, a very, very educated, a very aware and complicit section of the Indian public. And how do we counter that? So when we are talking about building movements, Shaheen Bagh happens, and we know that there is resistance in Shaheen Bagh. We know there is resistance in Kashmir. We know there is resistance among students in Jamia, in Aligarh, in JNU at enormous personal cost. And we know that there is no fear of arrest, there is no fear of any kind of dangers. But the biggest obstacle really comes from the validation of this regime by people who are in control of institutions, by people who are in control of education and science, by people who are in control of research funding, fellowships, and the futures of entire generations. So the challenge to the communalization of India really also, rests on how we are going to use our claim, our collective claim to the Constitution as commons, to wrest these institutions and to wrest these spaces back towards towards a collective imagination of the future. The question of the media is another question that I'm extremely troubled about. And I am troubled about it also because I seem to occupy that liminal space between media and academics. Very often, I don't quite know where I belong. Academics, media, activism, it kind of all keeps getting mixed up one with the other. And I still remember Professor Hargopal. He is a dear friend, and of course I can name him. I still remember Professor Hargopal telling me not very long ago, I think it was after the last piece that I wrote, that somebody, he didn't name that somebody, but that somebody called him and asked him, how does she write like this? How does she say this? Doesn't she know that she is under threat by saying this? And then Hargopal just laughed it off and said, I'm sure she does, and she does it anyway. I was quite surprised because nothing that I say really is out of the ordinary. It's what several of us who believe in the Constitution are saying all the time. But what that signals to me is that even the informed reader understands now that the media is not a free space. And even the informed reader finds it necessary to send a gentle word of caution, asking you to just pull back a bit. At a time when, in fact, you can't afford to pull back. It is a question, like I constantly say, it is a question of life and death at this point. It is a question of life, death, and freedom. And that is the point at which you can't pull back. You shouldn't pull back. Uh, and pulling back is really not an option to dealing with a carceral state. And pulling back is not an option to trying to cope with the judicial validation of a carceral state. Because if you pull back, then the threshold drops even lower. It is only by hanging in there that you can actually keep the threshold high and keep pushing the threshold as high as possible. And the danger of whittling down that media space is also evident, for instance, in the condemnation of the media, of the media, uh, of the incitement to hate by the media. Uh, and I don't want to popularize, you know, these advocates of hate speech by mentioning them by name. All of us know who they are, and their tribe only increases. And the challenge before us is really, how is our tribe going to increase? And how are we actually going to multiply the voice and visibility of our tribes, yeah, that speak in plural tongues, that are diverse, and that are collectively and in all their diversity kind of wedded uh, to and swear by the Constitution as commons? How do we, how do we begin to reimagine a future for the Constitution? And on a more immediate level and on an everyday level, how do we combat the stigmatization and the violence that Muslims in India today are rendered vulnerable to? This is not something that we can take, uh, you know, uh, easily. This is not something that we can afford at any level to be indifferent to, because hate politics that targets Muslims targets us. Hate politics against Muslims diminishes us all. It whittles down the potential and the futures of the Constitution. And so really, again, when I speak of, when I try to think through the entire, the vast arena of what we might call the communalization of India, uh, I'm just saying, can we sit back for a minute and take stock of how much of the India that we know, how much of the India that we believe we belong to uh, is alive still, and how may we together go about retrieving our idea of India? That really is the challenge before us today. Thank you. I'd be happy to take comments if they come up in the chat, but yeah, I'm done. Thank you very much. Um, I have quite a few comments here in the comment box, but nothing that I need to respond to. And like I said, I was seeing this session more as triggering or furthering a conversation that you know uh, that has been underway for a while, and that we need to take forward. My question is, of course, how might we take this forward, and what does that taking forward actually entail? There are risks, there are costs, and I speak also as somebody who heads an institute that is supported by the ICSSR. And I am aware of that institutional location as I speak. I may easily issue a disclaimer, but that disclaimer really counts for nothing. Uh, but uh, but yeah. So, Soma wants me to clarify the case of the Adivasis. So that's like that requires an entire session in itself. But basically, about 10 days ago, I think, and Nandini Sundar, in fact, has a very useful article on that case in The Wire. So you might actually look at that. But it is a case in which the Supreme Court decided that schools for Adivasi children in scheduled areas need not anymore recruit only Adivasi teachers. And what was actually special protections for in Adivasi homelands was interpreted as 100% reservation. But I mean, that's really not doing justice to the entire history of the case. Like I said, do look at the judgment and at Nandini's article on that. On how do we begin to engage with new converts to communal politics, Nilika? Well, like we've been engaging with the old ones, I'm hoping that because the new ones are new, they won't be as hardened as the old ones, and it will, be relatively easier for us to start a conversation with them. But it is around conversations and around deliberations and around resistance on a very, very everyday level. And of course the fact that the constitutional courts really belong to us all. They belong to us as citizens of this country who have a stake in the Constitution. And it doesn't matter if we get, adverse decisions. The fight has to be taken each time against the state into constitutional courts. The assertion of the vertical rights of citizen against state and horizontal rights of citizen against citizen must constantly be taken to courts. And on that, there can be no pulling back. Because we can't forget that very often, judges are educated by people, by petitioners who take these cases to court. So if we stop going, then an important medium of public education for the judiciary will get cut off, and we can't do that, can we? So on that note, I will say Jai Bhim and Johar, and stay well and safe till we meet again. Thank you.